Good evening. My name is Jenny Amory, and I'm honored to be the Executive Director of the Brookline Community Foundation. And I'm so happy to see you all here tonight. Thank you for coming. BCF plays a unique role in our community. We shine a spotlight on critical issues, such as we're doing tonight in this forum. We inspire philanthropy, including through our Brookline Teen Grantmaker program, and we award strategic grants to many nonprofits throughout town. Tonight, we are here to dig deeper into BCF's latest research report, Understanding Brookline, a Report on Poverty. This report reflects BCF's commitment to fostering informed dialogue about the issues that matter most to us as a community. It's also a direct outgrowth of the Foundation's 3-year strategic plan called Brookline Forward, in which we outline our strategic priorities, including to reduce and alleviate poverty. You know, many of us were surprised to learn in our first Understanding Brookline report that there's 13% poverty rate here in town. I know I was even more surprised in this new report to learn that nearly 30%, or almost 1 in 3 of our neighbors live with economic insecurity, which is 300% of poverty. While it may be a surprise to some, many in this room may know well what it is like to live in poverty or with economic insecurity. And I believe that in this town, with the resources we have available, no one should have to struggle to meet their most basic needs. And before I share about our program tonight that will address these issues, I want to appreciate our corporate sponsors who have made the report and our event possible. Please see your program for a list of all of them. It's a great group. And I particularly want to mention our visionary sponsors, Bovie and Langa, and TripAdvisor Charitable Foundation. And also with deep appreciation for TripAdvisor Charitable Foundation for not only tonight's sponsorship, but also making a significant 3-year grant to support our strategic plan. And now we will begin the program, which we hope will give insight to some of the day-to-day struggles for folks living in poverty, highlights from our report about factors contributing to poverty and recommendations, and then a national perspective on income inequality. And at the end, we will have time for your questions, and I will share some actions that we can take together. To start the program, I have the pleasure to introduce Nadia Chamblin Foster, who works every day on the front lines of fighting the effects of poverty. She is the Executive Director of Steps to Success, which is a proven program that gives students from low-income families the resources they need to stay on track and graduate and go on to college success. Nadia, with pleasure.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank Jenny, her team, as well as the Board of Directors at BCF for having the foresight to organize such an incredible program, an important discussion, and to being an incredible resource to Steps to Success. We're truly blessed to be part of the BCF family. As some of you know, Steps was founded in 2001 through a partnership between the Public Schools of Brookline, the Brookline Housing Authority, as well as the Brookline Community Foundation, really as a way to address some pretty startling disparities between low-income students and their peers in addressing college matriculation. Only about 30 to 50% of students were applying to college and going on to college. And I'm very proud to say that we are achieving over 90% of college matriculation. So it's been an incredible 15 years. The work of STEPS is really based on sort of many principles, which is about connecting with students, really establishing a deep connection to students, and ensuring that we start early. We start in grades 4 and follow them through college. We also believe that it's important for us to make a connection to families as well as to our educational partners. The STEPS model is pretty unique in that we're based within schools. There are many other programs that are STEPS-like, but they're either based within the Housing Authority or they're a separate entity altogether, and they're really focused on just the high school years and helping students matriculate and think about college. What's also very important about our work is that Alan knows this, that I consider ourselves to be public health workers, community health workers, because it is a really intensive wraparound approach, in that we try to be a coach, mentor, social worker, case manager, and really addressing all the issues of a family. And one of the most important components is about ensuring student success. One would think it's only about academic success, but it's really about life success. And some of the challenges that our students and our families face, I mean, there's so many gamuts, right? There's so many issues that really come out of as a result of poverty, and certainly there are many of my peer organizations, my fellow EDs that are doing incredible work in the town in addressing either food insecurity, providing a safe space here at the BTC for students to come to after school, whether it be clothing programs. But one of the issues is how students of low income are perceived, are viewed within their school communities, and how their parents' voice, their family's voice is respected, valued, encouraged within the school community. And often steps into that, rather, as an advocate in that role in ensuring that all students are accessing all services. This is an incredible school district. I'm a product of the school district. However, when students are first generation to graduate sometimes from high school, first generation to apply to college, to get into college, first generation culturally, it's often hard, difficult to access the services within the school and school environments, such as even in like a place like Brookline. Other challenges around cultural competency and how teachers, educators understand the issues of poverty in our town. I think often people think about poverty as being this thing that's happening in this third world country, that it's the man that sits in front of Dunkin' Donuts or Starbucks. But in fact, many students that are sitting in front of them are facing issues of poverty and facing issues of just resourcelessness. Often families do not know how to access the kinds of services that are available to them. One story that haunts me, that I learned early in my career within STEPS, is that we have an incredible school lunch system, and fortunately our students are able to access free and reduced lunch. And often we don't think about the child after June 20th, the last day of school, and how that breakfast and lunch meal, right? Where will they get that meal? And I had to learn that from a camp partner. Our students were fortunate to be able to access a quality camp. And one of the most frustrating parts for that director of that camp was having our students show up to camp hungry and not with lunch. And I'm a public health worker. That's my background, that I've done a lot of work in public health. And it was so frustrating for me that, gosh, here, we're doing all this incredible work with students, and yet we were unable to fix this small problem of just making sure kids had enough to eat in the summer months. I want to wrap this up. I know I don't have too much time left. Is really a call to action to all of you to be an advocate for those who are voiceless, for those who are invisible in our community. Poverty is invisible. And I'm so grateful to the BCF community for this report. Often I bring it with me when I'm having conversations with potential funders, with the potential partners, not only here in the town, but outside of the town. So I ask that you continue to educate your peers, folks in power, philanthropists who are doing incredible work outside of the zip code, and let them know about the resources that are available here, and that they should continue to invest in an organization like the BCF, as well as the other small organizations around the town that are trying to do good work. We also ask you to give our students a chance, in that we value volunteers, we value mentors, Many of our students are very much involved in the community and want to do more service and good, and all they're looking for is for ambassadors like yourself to open up doors for them. So I'm around if you have any questions for me, and thank you again for allowing me to share just a little bit about STEPS.
Thank you so much, Nadia, for your very powerful remarks and sharing the great work of Steps to Success. And now I have the pleasure to introduce Linda Olson-Pelkey, who is a BCF trustee and a Brookline resident. She's a writer, researcher, and urban planner with a lifelong commitment to fostering livable communities. Her professional planning experience includes land use and transportation planning at the local, regional, and state levels. With much gratitude for her work, all volunteer on this report, I'm pleased to welcome her to the stage. Linda.
Thank you, Jenny. Good evening. I'll be presenting some highlights from our second Understanding Brookline report, which focused on poverty and economic insecurity here in Brookline. Our research revealed several trends that are converging to cause greater financial stress for many of our neighbors. Stagnant and declining wages for low and middle income jobs, decreased public benefits and supports, rising costs for housing, healthcare, education, childcare, and more, coupled with increasingly complex and destabilizing social problems, such as domestic violence, homelessness, mental health issues, and substance abuse. Together, these trends have conspired to push more of our neighbors into poverty and economic insecurity. We appreciate this quote from Nelson Mandela because it reminds us that in many ways poverty is a social justice issue. He says that overcoming poverty is not an act of charity, it is an act of justice. It is the protection of a fundamental human right, the right to dignity and a decent life. In putting together the report, we gathered data from the Census Bureau's American Community Survey, we reviewed state and national research, and we interviewed staff and clients from many local agencies and nonprofits serving low-income individuals living in Brookline. As a result, the report presents a holistic picture of economic insecurity in Brookline. And it has three main parts. The first presents data describing some characteristics of those affected by poverty. The second part, we identify some of the complex factors contributing to poverty and the barriers to achieving economic stability once someone is struggling. And the third part surveys existing programs addressing poverty and recommends some additional steps we can take to help alleviate poverty. In 2012, approximately 13.2%, or almost 7,600 residents of Brookline, lived in poverty. Almost 30%, or 16,700 individuals, are facing potential economic insecurity. By way of comparison, the 2012 poverty rate in Massachusetts was 11.6, and for the U.S. as a whole, it was 15.7. What does it mean to be living in poverty? This table shows the federal poverty yearly income thresholds, which vary by household size. For a family of four, that's less than $24,000. For a couple, it's around $15,000, and for a single person, it's less than $12,000. Clearly, living at the poverty threshold is an indicator of serious economic hardship. These poverty statistics are a limited snapshot of a household's situation at one point in time. What's reported is a household's combined pre-tax income from all sources. But this is only one part of the story. Poverty status may be temporary or more long-term. A household could have very limited income but significant assets, such as a valuable home. Others may be faced with even greater stress on their finances, such as high medical bills, high child care costs, or substantial debt that are not factored in. While it is never easy to live on such limited income, it's fair to say that some of those living in poverty are facing more substantial barriers to achieving economic independence than others. The income levels at 185% of the poverty level are shown here because this is an income threshold often used to determine eligibility for public benefits. And as we will see, the 300%, or 3 times poverty level income, is an indicator of potential economic insecurity. The poverty rate in Brookline has increased rather dramatically, going from 9.3% in 2000 to 13.2% in 2012, an increase of almost 42%. This rate of growth outstripped most of our neighboring communities in Massachusetts as a whole. This chart shows Brookline's population distribution by age group, with the red part of the bar showing the portion living in poverty. As you can see, poverty affects all age groups, but some more than others. For instance, among young adults, there is a high poverty rate of almost 52%, while 17% of those 75 and older live in poverty. We wanted to get a sense of the size of the gap in income between living in poverty and being economically secure. One cost of living estimate done by the Crittenden Women's Union, a Boston-based nonprofit, shows what a typical household in Norfolk County in 2013 actually needs to get by. In this example, a single parent with 2 young children, one school-aged and one preschool, the yearly income required for economic independence is almost $75,000, which is 4 times the poverty threshold for a 3-person household, which is around $18,000. For this family, childcare is the largest single expense, making up 31% of their monthly budget. Significantly, there are no funds for saving or contingency needs in this budget. As we just saw, estimates of the yearly minimum income required to get by are 3 to 4 times the poverty threshold. So one way to interpret that is to assume that residents living in households with incomes at 300% of the poverty threshold may be experiencing economic insecurity. By this measure, almost 30%, or nearly 17,000 people in Brookline, could be economically insecure. Like the poverty by age group slide, this chart shows Brookline's population distribution by age group, with the red part of the bar showing the portion living at 300% of the poverty threshold. With this chart, we can identify pockets of vulnerability, such as the almost 50% of persons aged 75 or older who may be economically insecure. Why do I say these individuals are potentially or may be economically insecure? Just as with the poverty measure itself, the 300% poverty level is an important yet imperfect measure. For some households, other assets, such as a valuable home or retirement savings, may provide greater economic security, in which case living within this income range is less challenging. But for others, there may be significant strains on their finances, such as the high cost of childcare, as we saw in the sample budget. For some, this economic vulnerability means that an unexpected event like a job loss or a serious illness can precipitate substantial hardship. Next, we looked at what kind of living situation does the poverty population live in. The census estimates that 83% live in non-family households, with the greatest percentage, almost 35%, living in group quarters or other non-typical household settings, which include nursing homes, group homes, fraternities, etc. Townwide, college student group quarters make up about half of those living in group quarters. Almost as high at 33% are single-person households. 15% are in shared households with non-related persons, and the remaining 17% live in family households. Among families living in poverty, the largest group, at 8%, are those headed by single females. Many people assume that all or most of Brookline's poverty population lives in Brookline Housing Authority housing. But this is not the case, and in fact, only 13% of our population of poverty live in Brookline Housing Authority units. One indication of growing hardship is that between 2009 and 2013, visits to the emergency food pantry nearly doubled, increasing by 96.5%. There were well over 5,000 visits to the food pantry in 2013. The Brookline Community Foundation Safety Net provides financial assistance to residents for short-term emergency needs, such as help with rent to avoid eviction, food, clothing, or transportation. Requests to the safety net continue to grow, rising another 20% since 2012, with over 850 requests a year. There are many larger economic trends making it more difficult for some local families and individuals to make ends meet. Wages have not kept pace with inflation for large segments of the population. Nationally, for the lowest earning 40% of households, average income has dropped 9% since 2007. The cost of housing continues to climb. More than a third of Brookline homeowners and more than half of renters are housing cost burdened, spending over 30% of their income on housing. Affordable housing is in scarce supply with multi-year wait lists for public housing. Nationally, average health care costs rose by 21% between 2010 and 2013 for a family of 3. Child care costs in Massachusetts have continued to increase, rising 7.3% since 2010, and the average cost of family-based child care for one preschool-age child is more than $11,000 a year, while center-based child care is much more expensive. Demand for reduced price and subsidized child care greatly exceeds supply. On the state level, budget cuts have impacted many programs aimed at low-income households, and there's probably more to come. For instance, state funding has declined for direct cash assistance, public higher education, workforce development, and much-needed affordable housing. All of these cuts reduce opportunities for upward social mobility for Massachusetts low-income residents. We'd like to thank the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center for their excellent research and for letting us use their chart. Our research and interviews with service providers revealed an increase in multiple stresses that make stability challenging, with a growing number of residents in serious crisis. Brookline Housing Authority reports that its population has changed in recent years, with more people transitioning from homelessness, domestic violence situations, or both. The Brookline Community Mental Health Center estimates that 60% of homeless or near homeless persons have come from domestic violence situations. Psychological stress adds to the complexity. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services reports that adults living below poverty are 3 times more likely to experience psychological stress, compared to those at 200% of poverty. Those who struggle with mental illness and substance abuse find it difficult to find the services they need. Numerous studies suggest that economic distress significantly increases a person's likelihood of suffering from various psychiatric illnesses. So taking what we've learned about growing economic insecurity, increased demand for supports, gaps in services, and increasingly challenging personal difficulties, we've identified several general action areas to pursue. We will be hearing about some exciting initiatives to expand opportunity in a few moments from Professor Bluestone. Our recommendations fall into 3 general categories. First, increased support for emergency needs, such as the food pantry and safety net. Second, expand programs and opportunities that can lead to more long-term economic stability. And 3, advocate for broader policy solutions or alternative programs that directly address some of the fundamental causes of income inequality and economic hardship. Next, Ashley Mason, who is a member of the Community Foundation's Board of Trustees and chair of the Understanding Brookline Committee, will help us visualize some of this information. Ashley?
Nice to see all those faces out there. Thank you so much for being here. So we just heard a lot of incredible data from Linda, and now we wanted to try and make the data come to life by asking you to help us by participating in a visual representation of what these numbers really mean for our community. and it will also give some of you a chance to stretch your legs. To start out, assume that all of you in this room represent Brookline's population of nearly 59,000. And since people didn't sit up front, you're messing me up here, but anyway. With the first 3 rows that have a lot of people in them, stand up. So the first 3 rows on my left over here. Assume that there's people in all those seats. All right, yeah, we need more. Couple more. All right, yeah. All right, there we go. Okay. So those people standing represent the 9.3% of Brookline's population in 2000 that were living at or below the federal poverty threshold. So this is a little side note. So this is just to give you kind of the scene of percentages and how that fits into the community as a whole. So stay standing. Now, would the next row please stand up? Okay. So the additional people standing now illustrate the large increase in the poverty population between 2000 and 2012, which, as you've heard, rose from 9.3% to 13.2% of our population. Everyone stay standing? Now, would the next 2 rows stand up? Now, everyone standing are residents living at or below 185% of the federal poverty level, which, as Linda mentioned, is generally used as a threshold for receiving public assistance. This is nearly 20% of our residents. And finally, on this one, would the next 3 rows stand up? Now you can see the proportion of our residents who are living at or below 300% of the poverty level, which, as you've heard, is a marker of potentially significant economic insecurity. So can everyone just take a look at this for a moment? I think this is pretty telling. And this is nearly 30% of our neighbors. Okay, now I'm going to ask everyone to stand up. So now the whole room represents the poverty population in Brookline. And with the first 6 rows on my right, now sit down. Those who just sat down are men and boys living in poverty, and those who are still standing are women and girls living in poverty. As you can see, there's a significant disparity between males and females that make up our poverty population. Now, if everyone could stand back up one more time. You still represent Brookline's poverty population, and I would like the first 4 rows on my left over here to sit down. Those who just sat down are the portion of the poverty population that live in Brookline Housing Authority housing units. And those still standing are the poverty population in Brookline that does not live in Brookline Housing Authority housing. I think this is significant because we tend to think of our residents living in poverty as living solely in public housing, when in fact the vast majority do not. And lastly, could everyone stand back up one more time? Now the room represents the homeless and near homeless population in Brookline. With the first 8 rows on this side, sit down. Those standing represent the percentage of this population that has become homeless or faces homelessness due to domestic violence. And I'd like everyone to take a look around because I feel like this statistic really speaks for itself. Okay, now everyone can sit down. So that was, we wanted to give you a visual representation of the data and help just kind of make the data come alive. And now we are going to try and broaden our lens from Brookline to more of a national perspective. And to start us with this is our board president, Frank Steinfeld.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Ashley and Linda. You know, not every board has the right skill set and the kind of people who will put in the time that both of you did on this report. We're lucky to have you on BCF's board, and thank you for your dedication and passion. And Nadia, thank you for your insight into the lived experience of poverty in our community, and for showing how Steps to Success is directly improving the future for many of our students. And while I'm here, I'd also like to thank Jenny Amory, our executive director. Your great leadership and vision have really enabled BCF to grow into an increasingly important resource across Brookline. Now it's my honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Barry Bluestone. He is the Stearns Trustee Professor of Political Economy and the founding director of the Dukakis Center for Urban and Regional Policy at Northeastern. He's written widely in the areas of income distribution, business and industrial policy, labor management relations, higher education finance, and urban and regional economic development, all of which make our guest the ideal speaker to help us better understand Brookline. Professor Bluestone refers to the Dukakis Center as a think and do tank, since their focus extends beyond research to include influence and implementation. And when he met with a few of us over at BCF recently, he pointed out that universities tend to think and not do, and that foundations tend to do and not think. And he noted that our Understanding Brookline report and all of the research and outreach that went into it was a great example of foundation thinking that would support our work as a grant maker and a convener, as well as inform the community as a whole, which is exactly what we hope to do today and going forward. Before moving on to the main event, I'd like to thank our neighbor, Governor Dukakis, for helping introduce us to Professor Bluestone. We regret that he and Kitty couldn't join us today, but they're fortunate to reside in a warmer area of the country this time of year. And now, Professor Bluestone will help us to make some connections between what's going on in Brookline and some of the nation's broader economic challenges and opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frank and Jenny. I am absolutely staggered to see you all here. I thought earlier when I was trying to get here, and it took me an hour and 15 minutes to go 2.1 miles from Northeastern, that the 3 or 4 of us who got together would have a lot of fun tonight. Standing up, sitting down, figuring out. And I also know many of you in the room from one of my oldest friends that I just met again, Virginia LaPlante, who was the first person I met when I moved to Boston in 1971. Now, some of you may remember what Boston was like in 1971. It was a very different place than it was now. In fact, Virginia's late husband sold me my first rental house insurance. I had come here with a young lady from Ann Arbor, Michigan, where I had gone to university. I grew up in the great city of Detroit, Michigan, in the 1950s and 60s, when it was indeed the richest city on the planet Earth. Today, not so. But we got here, and I was, first of all, teaching. I've now taught for 44 years in Greater Boston, but my first job was down the road at Boston College. And so I was a young assistant professor. I think I was 26 years old. I came to Boston really on my very second trip. It was like the third day. And I met the most honest rental agent I've ever encountered in my life. I sat down with the rental agent and I said, we've just moved here. We need a very inexpensive apartment because I'm an assistant professor at Boston College, where they pay assistant professors the same as priests. The difference being, of course, that priests actually do take a vow of poverty. And he said to me, I think I can find you just the right place for you and your girlfriend. Do you mind a high crime rate? And I said, I'm not really fond of homicide, but what do you got in mind? He said, oh, no, homicide's not a problem. It's just, this is a neighborhood that actually has the highest burglary rate in the city, and it's got a small robbery rate, but, you know, be a little careful. And so I rented that first apartment for $216 a month, a one-bedroom, beautiful apartment, in the poorest section of Boston called Back Bay, 379 Marlborough Street. By the way, this was the most honest rental agent because we moved in on Thursday. My girlfriend and I set up the whole apartment. We had a new stereo. We were going to live it up. And we got into my beat-up car, put my 10-speed bike on the back, and we went up to the White Mountains. This is in August, to climb Mount Washington. And by the time we got back on Sunday, everything was gone, proving that this rental agent was honest. Now, what they didn't get was my 10-speed bike, because that was on the back of my car. They got that on Tuesday. So that was my introduction. I'm very pleased to be here, and it's wonderful because I have, as I said, so many friends in Brookline, and of course, Kitty and Michael are not only our mentors, but our very, very dear, dear friends, and they send their love and best to you from warm but dry LA. So I have put together something for you, and I've done it on the basis that I just collected my first Social Security check. I'm now 70 years old. They sent me a check. I don't know how many of you have gotten your first check. They've taken off the tagline, which was, "Congratulations, old fart, you've made it." And as a result, at that age, I realized, and my wife tells me, I can actually look back and see, you know, kind of history. And so what I decided to do, which I thought would be helpful in this discussion, was to take a look at inequality in America going back quite some time. And so we'll look at the beginning of the debate. I had a wonderful colleague named Bennett Harrison. Ben taught at MIT for many years. Some of you may know him. He unfortunately died at a very young age. But Ben and I worked together. He's my closest friend, closest colleague. And in 1986, so we're going back just shy of 30 years, we were asked to testify before the U.S. Congressional Joint Economic Committee on the so-called jobs miracle that had been brought to America by Ronald Reagan and supply-side economics. And we ended up writing a piece called The Great American Jobs Machine in 1986. And following that, the New York Times asked us to write an op-ed about what we had found, which was that we had created many jobs, not as fast as we had under Jimmy Carter, but the jobs were disproportionately low-wage jobs, unlike the great jobs we'd been creating in the 1950s and 1960s. In fact, the title that the New York Times gave our op-ed and gave us 2/3 of a page was The Grim Truth About the Jobs Machine. What was neat is the administration took a look at this and put together a small cadre of people to attack us, to support them. And in fact, Bill Brock, the Secretary of Labor, had come out of Tennessee, wrote a piece in the Washington Post in which said anybody who believes that Harrison and Bluestone are right are probably also a member of the Flat Earth Society. One of the greatest lines. In fact, I sent a note to Secretary Brock telling him how much I liked this line. And what he basically did was try to dispute that the jobs were so poor. It wasn't a very good retort, and indeed, to his credit, about 4 or 5 years later, when he was no longer Secretary of Labor, Secretary Brock called me and he said, "You guys were right, I was wrong." Right? And so there was an academic battle royal that started out of this. Economists across the country, some conservative, some liberal, some from Brookline, some from Boston. And out of that, we ended up writing our second book together. The first was called The Deindustrialization of America, The Loss of America's Manufacturing Might, written by a kid who grew up in Detroit, Michigan, and a kid who grew up in Jersey City, New Jersey. It's kind of telling our hometown stories. And our second book ended up being called The Great U-Turn, Corporate Restructuring and the Polarizing of America. And it came out in 1988. So we're not talking last year. We're talking a long time ago for all of us in this room. And the reason why it ended up being called The Great U-Turn is, as you'll see in some of my charts, I'm not going to go through too many, we found that, for example, income was going up, and then it was coming down. Inequality was going down, then it was coming up. Poverty rates were coming down, and now they were coming up. And we just looked at these charts that we were making on old 1401 IBM computers, and we kept seeing one U-turn after another after another. 1988. And so this was the book that came out, which I'm pretty proud of. Okay? In the preface to that paperback edition, Ben and I wrote that really what was being destroyed was the American dream, that the middle class in America was in trouble. 1988. Okay? And we said what America was founded on was the idea of a more equal society and a more equitable society. Okay? And the Great U-Turn set out to investigate what had happened to the American dream. Okay? So let's take a look at a few statistics. From 1947 to 1973, right after World War II, through the oil embargo of '73 that some of you in the room remember, we had the greatest period of economic growth in American history. Average wages, controlling for inflation, went up by 80%, with more and more women coming into the labor force, joining often their husbands. Family income, after controlling for inflation, literally doubled in a single generation, 47 to 73. And what that might mean is a family that could afford its first automobile in 1947 could afford a second one in 1973. The somewhat better off family that could afford, let's say in Detroit, their first home in 1947 also had a nice little cottage on a northern Michigan lake in 1973. If you could go out one night a week for dinner, you could now go out twice. And then you'll see it kind of flattens out. But what was amazing about this time, and gives the whole lie to the current economy, is at the same time the economy was growing faster than ever before, America was becoming more equal. Those in the bottom 20% of all families actually saw their annual income rise faster than anyone else. And indeed, those in the top quintile, the top 20%, the most well-to-do 20%, saw their income rise, but not as quickly as those in the middle or the bottom. And so we became a rapidly rich community where the riches were shared more equally, and I would say equitably, than ever before. Rapid growth does not mean inequality, maybe just the opposite. And then 73 hits, we get the oil embargo, the economy goes into a tailspin. From 1973 to 1986, the last data we had before we published this book, incomes don't rise at all, or practically at all. And not only do incomes not rise, America becomes more unequal. The top 20% see their income rise at a rate of 1.3% a year. The lowest actually saw their income fall between 1973 and 1995. I've updated those statistics. So that was then. Now is now. So let's take a look at what is happening. First of all, and this is good news, it's not just good, wonderful people in Brookline and Newton and elsewhere who are talking about inequality. Here is a quote about the growth of equality demands something more than economic growth. It also calls for decisions, mechanisms, and processes directed to a better distribution of wealth. That's Pope Francis. Or, this lack of mobility, just not income inequality, that we should focus on. That's Republican Senator Mark Rubio. Or, dangerous and growing inequality and lack of upward mobility has jeopardized middle-class America's basic bargain. That's President Obama. Or, rich businessmen like me don't create jobs, rather the consequence of an ecosystematic feedback. That's Nick Hanauer, who's a billionaire CEO, and he is portrayed in Bob Reich's film, Inequality for All. And then we have this guy who says, you know, we've got $1.7 trillion of wealth, my gang has been leaving the middle class in the dust. That's Warren Buffett. Okay? So, new data on income inequality. Just a few figures. So this is from since 1979 through 2010. You'll see that the top 1% saw their income rose by over 200%. You'll see that the next 19% saw their income rise by about 65%, so that's the top quintile, those are the top 20%. The median saw their real after-tax income increase by 49%, and the bottom 40%, and the bottom only 49%. And that's back all the way back to 79. More recently, there's been no income growth at all. Okay. You also know there's great inequality among cities. So here is the latest data from Brookings, and it shows that Boston is the fourth most unequal metropolitan area, these are metro areas, in the country. Atlanta, San Francisco, Miami, followed by Washington, were much more equal than New York. And the way to think about it is they compared the income of the 20th percentile, the person who was at the 20th percentile, the top of the 20th percentile, with the person who was at the 95th percentile, that is the bottom of the top 5%. And the ratio was 15.3 to 1 between the rich person and the poor. In Boston, it was half that in cities like Oklahoma City and Raleigh, right? But there's also a problem, and that is where income inequality is greatest, generally that is also where the cost of living is the highest. So New York, Washington, then Boston, and San Francisco have the highest cost of living in the country. This comes from the Economic Policy Institute, similar to the numbers that you suggested to us. But here's also the problem, and it's digging even deeper into the foundation report. And I was so pleased to see the work you did on looking not just at poverty levels, but looking at economic insecurity and other income levels. And the reason is, those poverty levels that you saw are federal poverty levels for the 48 contiguous states, right? That includes Detroit, where my home, where I lived in high school, looked very similar to some of the nicer homes here in Brookline. So, brick house, slate roof, coppers this. You come in a beautiful front door. There's a beautiful library with leaded glass to the left. There's a nice living room with a marble fireplace, pretty good size. You go down the corridor. I'm remembering this house from the time I was in high school in the 1960s or late 50s. To the right was a beautiful dining room with another leaded glass door, and then back was a kitchen with a dinette, very large. Behind that was a beautiful deck, followed by a backyard, 2-car garage, fully furnished basement, upstairs 4 bedrooms, 2 baths upstairs, 1.5 baths elsewhere. That house just sold because I was back for my 50th high school reunion 2 years ago for $38,000. Okay? In perfect condition. In perfect condition. So the cost of living in a city like Detroit is a fraction, and yet the poverty level that we use is the same. Here we have the third highest cost of living in housing, third highest overall cost of living. So those poverty levels actually do not really describe how desperately poor we are, because it isn't the income alone that matters, it's what that income can buy, and it just buys a whole lot less here. Okay? So finally, let's ask some questions about what is responsible for the increase in income inequality. And once people started recognizing that inequality was a problem, a number of years after Ben and I had written our book and had a lot of publicity about it, there were a number of conferences of economists who came together. I remember going to one at the Federal Reserve Bank here in Boston, and they all would get up and they all said, well, this is something we can't do much about because it's all quote-unquote skill-biased technological change, which means the world is globalizing. Those people who have really good skills are going to do really well, and those who do not are competing with low-wage labor in China and Vietnam, you name it, India, and they're going to get slaughtered, and therefore the inequality is all due to just technological change, and there's not much we can do about it. And I looked at that and I said, it's hard to believe that the changes in technology have been so explosive that they could explain all of this mammoth growth in inequality. And so I ended up writing an article called Murder on the Inequality Express. Some of you may remember Agatha Christie, Murder on the Orient Express. Anybody want to tell me who did it? All of them. Exactly, all of them. So here were the suspects. One was technology. Two was deindustrialization. I come out of Detroit, right? People with reasonable high school education were making good money working in the auto industry. I spent 3 summers building carburetors and alternators at the Ford Rawsonville plant. I built planned obsolescence in the Ford products of the 1960s, including the carburetors for the very first Ford Mustang. And we lost those jobs, and they were good jobs. Deregulation of one industry after another, declining unionization, downsizing of industries to smaller firms that pay less, winner-take-all labor markets where a small number of people in a company get all the rewards. President of Northeastern University gets over $3 million a year. Our adjuncts have just organized and are trying to get a contract. Free trade, capital mobility, immigration, trade deficits, and all that. Finally, it's not just about inequality. Let's say we had a tremendously unequal society, but everybody in society had the same shot at getting to the top. We still wouldn't like the inequality, but at least it wouldn't be anywhere near as concentrated as here. But as you can see in this chart, if you start out poor because of your poor parents and so forth, you will very likely end up poor. And your chances of getting to the top are very small. And if you're at the very top, you have to really screw up to get to the bottom. Actually, what we find is to move out of the bottom quintile, the most important thing is education, but it helps to be white, it helps to be male, it helps to be a homeowner, it helps to be married, it helps to work more hours, and it's really good to have a spouse who works lots of hours too. Whereas falling out of the top often is a result of poor health or disability. Okay? And then we can look at intergenerational mobility over time. What are your chances your kids will be able to move up? And the answer is the United States is so far below that in the United Kingdom. France, Germany, Sweden, Canada, Finland, Norway, Denmark. In Denmark, a kid starting out the bottom has 3 times the chance. Okay? And most importantly, we see how important this is. I could go through wealth inequality and show you the same thing, but let me just finish by talking about what might be done about some of the things about inequality. One is we should be providing lifelong education and continuous retraining from early childhood education through adult education. We should help build a manufacturing renaissance, as we're doing in Massachusetts. We've done tons of work on that at the Dukakis Center. Manufacturing's booming again, helping many of our older industrial cities. We need to organize the unorganized. Unions played an important role in building our middle class. We need fair trade policies, not just free trade policies, with labor standards and environmental standards built in. And we need to raise the minimum wage. Okay? We need more progressive income taxes. We need to expand the earned income tax credit. We need to help single adults get EITC as well. We could expand the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, SNAP, the food stamp program, expand Section 8 housing. All of these will help, okay? And then we can talk about, if you'll give me one more minute, I want to talk about what we might do in terms of our kids. So I want to tell you about a kid I know who I call the most overprivileged Cambridge-raised kid on the planet. He was born to 2 parents who lived together. Neither parent has ever been unemployed, and even an hour in their lives. Both parents have PhDs. Even before this kid was born, his parents were actually reading to him. The kid attended a quality daycare program where his daycare teacher actually had a PhD in child psychology from Harvard. When he was 5, he was enrolled in a private elementary school where he was nurtured and educated by the people of the Cambridge Friends School. He was a superstar soccer player and had spectacular adults as coaches from the time he was 8. He took guitar lessons from the time he was 12 with a great musician. He attended a private high school, BB&N, where he was recruited to play high school soccer, where he had great teachers and leaders. He traveled the world with his parents. He had great medical care, and not surprising, he graduated actually last June from Northwestern University. His name is Josh Bluestone, my son. Okay? Now, let's take a kid that was born this morning in the Boston Medical Center, BMC, the hospital, let's say either in Roxbury or to a low-income family here in Brookline, or in Newton, where we're working very closely with Newton's Mayor Seti Warren on very much the same issues as you are. Heads home this afternoon, maybe, with mom, maybe dad, likely young, unemployed, and has had little training in her new role as mother, probably learned more about, like we did, more about how to drive a car than to raise a kid, right? Field books in the home. Daycare was limited and likely warehousing rather than real education. School is likely underperforming and only lasts 180 days, which is 17% of the waking hours of a child between the time they're 0 and 18. Few options for sports or arts programs. Now, what do you think are the chances that that child will have the same life chances as Josh Charles Bluestone when she or he turns 23, as my son has? So I think we have to think about universal high-quality natal care, parent effectiveness training, universal early year-round childhood education, improving the public schools, extracurricular sports, arts, you name it. That's why I love working with the boys' clubs in the Y. Summer camp experiences, summer jobs for high school kids, great vocational education programs for those that really could use them, increased access to affordable higher education. Now, this will cost a fortune to do it right, not just in Brookline, nationwide. But think about it. If we really did it, we'd only have to do it for a single generation, rather than paying it out generation after generation after generation. Thank you. By the way, I have to, as a parent, how many of you have college-age kids? How many have grandchildren? I am so proud of my kid. I couldn't get him to come to any school in the Northeast, so he went to Northwestern, coldest place on the planet Earth, even including Boston. But, and he graduated with honors. He's teaching 4th grade in the Chicago public schools, in a school which is all Mexican, American, and Puerto Rican kids. That's what a good upbringing will do for you.
Well,
Is there time for a question or two?
yes, I'd like to open it up to the group. I want to thank Professor Bluestone again for helping us think about how we can use research like this to improve how we work at the foundation, and I think in all of the areas that we pursue out here. So if folks are willing and able, we'd like you to come up to the mics on the sides here and identify yourselves. You don't have to say your precinct, but just come on up and address questions to Professor Bluestone. I'm sure there must be a few out there.
Can I ask a question from here?
I can hear you fine.
Sure.
But this
Do
country,
you want to identify yourself first, please? Thank you.
this country's willing to spend, I'm going to say $60,000, $70,000 a year to put away a man in prison, okay? But they could use that same money to send him to Harvard. And, I mean, just look at that, for smoking reefer, and right now, we're making reefer legal in some states like Washington and Massachusetts. What a waste of money.
Absolutely. We incarcerate over 2 million people in prison or jail in the United States. Much more than any other country, but maybe Australia, on a per capita basis. And it is a huge proportion of those people are in jail for nonviolent offenses. I've always believed, and I'm not a criminologist, that we need to have a totally different way of dealing with criminal justice. First of all, we should do away with these nonsense crimes. And Washington, D.C. just did away with it. It was an NPR story today, particularly having to do with weed, with what we used to call weed, marijuana. Okay? I want to do an advertisement in a second if I can, because I want you all to join me next fall. So one of the things we should do, but I'm also been thinking, and this is off this topic, that we should be making penalties fit the crime. I mean, we put people away for years for, let's say, bank fraud. or some of the Wall Street financiers who destroyed the economy and destroyed countless tens of thousands of lives. We shouldn't have put any of them in prison. We should have just said, because they go to prison for 10 years and then they come out and they have all the wealth they had before. You are going to live on $25,000 for the rest of your life. Anything above that is 100% taxed away, including any gift you get. That's a penalty that fits the crime and saves us $77,000 a year in locking them up. We should be thinking about those things. But certainly, I mean, California now has finally recognized that 3 strikes and you're out has bankrupted the state, where they were spending literally 30% more on the prisons than they were higher education. That makes no sense. We've got to deal with prison reform. We've got to deal with criminal justice reform. And I think you're absolutely right.
Thank you. And Arthur's shown that you don't have to come up to the mic. So do other folks have questions for Professor Bluestone?
Welcome to my neighborhood. I've thought about that question. The question is, where would you prioritize? Because let's face it, Charlie Baker and the legislature are just about ready to cut the Head Start program in Massachusetts. Okay? Head Start. We're facing a $765 million deficit this year. We're going to face a $1.5 billion deficit in the state budget next year, fiscal 16. My colleague at the Dukakis Center, Alan Clayton Matthews, who was on the Council of Economic Advisors to Governor Patrick, also as the chief economic forecaster for the state, and has worked as the chief economist for the Department of Revenue, will tell you that it's not going to get any better in the out years because of pension costs and healthcare costs. So we have very limited funds, and therefore that fortune we're going to have to figure out how we're going to raise the funds for it. One thing is, before we can raise more funds, I think we should prioritize those funds, and be honest, I think they should be prioritized at early childhood education. I think that's the key, because if you make early childhood education work better, you solve problems as you go along, and therefore you should do that. Seti Warren is a dear friend of mine, the mayor of Newton, who would love to sit down with the foundation here and talk about how Brookline and Newton could work together. I told him, I had breakfast with him yesterday and said I was going to be here. He'd love to sit down with you. His wife is a brain researcher at Harvard, and she actually does MRIs of kids' brains, and you find out, and many of you may know this, that most of your neural development, right, is complete by age 3. And that's the time when you have to get to kids. That's why we started reading to Josh the day after our doctor told us that Emmy was pregnant. We figured maybe, so we were reading Dr. Seuss 6 months before he was born. And it's clearly made a big difference, particularly. You should see his sense of humor. So, can I make one advertisement before we close? One of the things that I'm most proud of, and I want you to really consider doing this because you're the perfect, many of you are all of you are the perfect audience for this. I was dragged to Northeastern by the former president, Richard Freeland, who knew me quite well, to set up what became the Dukakis Center, in order to build a center devoted to the community. That was Think and Do. But then about 2006, I went back to President Freeland and I said, we should do something bigger. We should create a school of public policy and urban affairs devoted to creating the next generation of really smart, conscientious, well-motivated young people to take our place. And he agreed. And so I became, and then after the trustees agreed to this, he came in with an Excalibur, he whacked me on the shoulder, and he made me the dean, which I didn't want to do, but I agreed to doing it. And my very first thing I did as dean was to create something called the Open Classroom. Have any of you ever attended the Northeastern Open Classroom? So you guys know what it is. And what it is it's an undergraduate, now an undergraduate, was a graduate course with real undergraduate students, but the lectures are open free to the public every Wednesday night. So for example, next Wednesday we have Jay Ash, the Secretary of Housing and Economic Development. We were going to have Stephanie Pollack, my former Associate Director of the Dukakis Center, now trying to save the tea. Unfortunately, she will be away that day saving the tea. But we've had Seti Warren, we've had Lisa Wong. But here's the advertisement. We have decided collectively that next fall, and the class runs from just after Labor Day on Wednesday night, 6 to 8 until end of December, we're going to call the course 1965. It's going to be a retrospective on the 60s, beginning with the election of John F. Kennedy of Brookline, Massachusetts, in November of 1960, through the Freedom Rides in the South in 61, to the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, the War on Poverty in 64, Medicaid and Medicare, 1965, the birth of the birth control pill, 1965, the Vietnam War, the draft. How many of you men in the room remember your draft number? Yeah? 36. All the way through to landing on the moon in August of 1969. In addition, we're talking with UMass Boston and we're talking with Tufts about adding to it both a film festival of the iconic films of the 1960s, think The Graduate, Easy Rider, right? Psycho. And a music festival that will start with, you know, Joan Baez, Judy Collins, up through Bob Dylan, the Beatles, the Stones, and of course, Motown. And I hope you'll all consider coming. I think it's going to be the greatest thing, and we're going to ask the question, what did we learn from the 60s? And also we should ask the question, what didn't we learn? Like, don't get involved in stupid wars. But I would love to have you come. Keep track of it. Just check our website or Google Northeastern Open Classroom, and you'll hear all about it. And we're going to have a lineup of some of the most spectacular speakers you'd ever want, and then great music, great stuff, and please come. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you all, folks. And now, we hope that this is really just the beginning of an ongoing conversation with all of you about how we can move forward on a lot of these issues. And now to close out the event, I'd like to invite Jenny Amory back to the stage.
Thank you, Professor Bluestone, and also Frank. Wow, this has been a lot to absorb, but you know what? It leaves me feeling really hopeful. Hopeful that together we can continue the important work that so many are already doing. Hopeful that we can innovate and find new solutions to old problems. Hopeful that together we can reduce and alleviate poverty in Brookline and make the lives of those who struggle to make ends meet easier. Tonight was just a part of the work that has already been underway from many of you in the room, community leaders, town officials, faith leaders. At BCF, we are passionate and committed to doing our part to build a better Brookline for all of our neighbors. But of course, we can't do this without you. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you again to our generous sponsors. For our part at BCF, we will be awarding about $355,000 in grants this year to organizations making a difference in Brookline. And we will continue to host convenings of the amazing executive directors in town who are working on poverty throughout the year. What can you do? First, you can share this report or ask for extra copies. Let's spread the word on this largely invisible picture of economic insecurity and poverty in town. If we don't know the problems that exist, we can't create change. Second, you can become more involved in a local organization making a difference in your own backyard. Lastly, you can always make an immediate difference today by giving a gift to BCF that will support strategic grants to effective community organizations. BCF typically receives 3 times more requests than we can grant, and there's so much more that we can do. Your donation of whatever amount can really make a difference. Your financial support enables us to do the kind of in-depth research that led to tonight's event. It also enables us to fund new ideas, as we did 14 years ago with Steps to Success, and about 8 years ago with the Brookline Teen Center. It enables us to support programs such as Women and Girls Thriving, and the BCF Safety Net at the Brookline Community Mental Health Center, and Next Steps program at the Brookline Housing Authority, to name just a few. And also your support helps to launch new ideas, such as the Endowed BCF Scholarship Fund for Brookline High School, which actually began as a request from the town and evolved into a new collaboration with Brookline High School and the town itself. Currently, there's only $150,000 available annually in scholarship awards, which doesn't approach the critical need for support. We hope this fund creates a lasting legacy for generations of students to come. And this work is tied directly to reducing and alleviating poverty. Did you know, in fact, that research shows that there's $1 million difference over a lifetime between a high school graduate's earnings and those with a bachelor's degree? A special thanks to Brookline Bank, who gave a multi-year commitment to be the lead corporate sponsor for this new initiative. And now I'm going to wrap up by thanking the tremendous staff and board who organized this event, in particular with much appreciation to our BCF staff, Nadia, Alex, and a special thanks to Riley, who led this effort. I can see them in the back room. You did a great job. Woo! I also want to thank Rena and Katie, who contributed to the beautiful report itself, and also to the many volunteers, including Sitska, Judy, Carrie, Rebecca, and the High Rock Brookline members, and the Brookline Teen Grant Makers. Are the Brookline Teen Grant Makers in the room still? All right, we love you. And to our hosts, the Brookline Teen Center, including Jen and Matt, who gave an enormous amount of time along with their staff. This event couldn't have happened without them. There's Matt, thank you, and Jen. In Brookline, we have the power to create enormous change, and we will. Thank you for coming. We look forward to our continued work together. Please mingle, enjoy refreshments, and have a good night.